Hey everyone, Georgie here with Ukraine Matters. We have a lot of very important things to talk about, so watch this until the end. And if you don't have the time to watch it in one sitting, maybe then try to use the timestamps that I put for you so you can watch this in multiple sittings. We'll start with battle lines. And generally speaking, right now Ukraine is in a shaping phase of the counteroffensive. It's mostly using right now cheap Chinese drones to strike different parts of faraway Russian logistics. So it's yet to engage some of the closer range missiles on scale, such as HIMARS, such as other artillery pieces. Interesting news on HIMARS came out this week is that Russians have been adapting to not really shoot the HIMARS GMLRS rockets because it's problematic for them. They're really, really fast and really, really precise. But what Russians was able to do is put the GPS jammers, which have been used by GMLRS before, to navigate to the where the strike coordinate is affecting. So that's an interesting development in a war that I think you might find fascinating. But as far as we've heard, right now, Ukrainians and the American engineers have already been working for a solution for this. We then transition to the frontline overview in general. I will not really say that there is anything of strategic or operational significance that is happening on the Kherson frontline. The only thing that we must note is that during the week, Kherson region on the Ukrainian side has been heavily shelled by the Russians. A lot of people died, and it's a complete atrocity because most of people that got basically wounded or killed are civilians. There was almost no military objective struck, which is it's just this war never ceased to devastate to underscore the scale of atrocities that Russians are, because obviously they were all very happy. On a front line, we have something I guess I also need to address is that we've seen Russian propaganda change a lot of its narrative. Mostly a lot of these operational news coverage, Telegram channels, people on that usually were reporting some kind of activities on the front line have shifted a lot of narratives. And a lot of them have been reporting certain fights that happened. For example, I will take this as an example. They've said that some villages were captured by Ukrainians around like Myrne and essentially somewhere in this area. I mean, you don't need to be a rocket scientist to understand that capturing villages by Ukrainians in this area doesn't make a lot of sense. Like, it's so far beyond the front line. But this goes well into the all kind of narrative that was running before for the last week plus, where there was an over-exaggeration of what Ukrainian forces have achieved. I was talking about certain things, for example, that Ukrainians were poking, oh, sorry, I should use blue for Ukrainians, that Ukrainians were poking in the area just south of Orikhiv, right here. And Russians on that were reporting, oh my God, Ukrainians are breaking through our front lines and they are completely already overrunning us. And it's not for me yet completely clear why this is being done. What's the goal of this narrative? There are a couple of floating theories why it's that, but I'm still yet not sure about what's the complete purpose. But that is something we need to keep in mind. So whenever we hear that Ukrainians are being active, or Russian running, or Ukraine is penetrating deep into the enemy lines, we need to, for now, be aware that a lot of the news coming from the Russian sources are over exaggerating the scale of what is actually happening, because most of the reports where Ukrainians were attacking were true. The attacks were there. It's just they were not to the scale that Russians have been reporting. On the eastern front lines, fighting is continuing. I'm gonna say just generally for the Avdiivka, Marinka, and this direction here. And I also would probably say Vuhledar. This is where Ukrainians are having some local probing or like some local counteroffensives, and some of them are successful, some of them less successful. But all of this is still tactical fighting in the same way as I was reporting before that Russians were trying to attack. They maybe gained a position or two, and that's it. Like, so there are other channels that cover the positional and tactical fighting. Generally speaking, Ukraine is right now here a little bit more aggressive, and this is what we need to know. Bakhmut situation. I know you want to hear me talk about Prigozhin, about what he's doing, and we're going to cover that, but just a bit later. Right now in Bakhmut, I reported at the start of the week in a previous video, you can watch it somewhere, that there was a little bit of a silence right around the 1st and 2nd of May, where Russians were not attacking as hard, and Ukrainians were actually reporting that, hey, it seems that they're preparing for something, which kind of makes sense because 9th of May is coming. 9th of May is like a Russian propagandist galore fest about how their glorious country won over Nazis, obviously single-handedly, with no support from the West at all. And they are basically they want to deliver some kind of a propaganda news for that particular event. It would be very nice for Putin. Now, will they do it? I trust in the armed forces of Ukraine, and a lot of the armed forces of Ukraine people are saying no chance. No chance. But obviously, as I said from the start, they were not attacking before. Right now, since yesterday, since the 5th, like since the 6th of May, the attacks on Ukrainian positions pretty much all across this kind of half circle area have intensified significantly. So they pulled back, relaxed, regrouped, found out all of the people that were half wounded, half ready, who had some kind of inventory, and now resumed. So we should expect that the next couple of days will be extremely, extremely hard for Ukrainian defenders. And we do get reports from the Ukrainian defenders that it's a huge meat grinder over there. And I think that's where the major action is happening. On Kremina, I'm just going to mention that this is still positional fighting is happening. Russians, they are still trying to do some kind of tactical improvements in the area. Ukrainians to the lesser extent, but overall the situation is stable. So we can move to the next topic. And while you're here, can I kindly ask you to go please under the video, hit the like, subscribe, and share this video to your social networks so the video gets more exposure. Leave your comments under the video so I know what you're thinking, and join Discord so we can chat about it at some point. One of the most discussed topics this week has been Prigozhin himself and situation with Wagner in Bakhmut. And to understand what's happening, let's go over some certain details and what's the implications of this. Firstly, the most important thing that we need to understand about Prigozhin is that he is very loud, but he's not that important. And because we've fallen into the somewhat of a propaganda trap, you can say a red herring of sorts. We've fallen into the understanding that a lot of war situation in Ukraine is centered around Bakhmut and situations with Wagner's, that the Wagner group is apparently this almighty force that is almost completely dominating Ukrainian army. Listen to me here, I'll explain. But basically some kind of a narrative that at least this is the part of Russian force that is really, really difficult for Ukrainians to deal with. And it's essentially the fact that it's going away from Bakhmut potentially, then it can be problematic. Now, the important part here to note is that that is completely not true. Bakhmut does not define the war in Ukraine. Bakhmut is just a place where the responsibility for that front line was dedicated to Prigozhin. And Prigozhin has made a big deal of it. He made a fuss about this. Obviously, Ukrainians didn't want to give up Bakhmut, but compared to other parts in the front line where Russians were attacking, and when they started receiving certain losses, like levels of losses, these losses were treated like as unacceptable, and a lot of the assaults like that stopped. That is not what happened with Wagner's. Wagner's applied completely inhumane tactics where they got essentially access to a free meat deli from Russian prisons, and they were able to utilize a lot of these death squads and meat waves to essentially go forward. The problem is Bakhmut is a very narrow part of the front line, and it doesn't define the outcome of the war or anything else, because while Wagner forces are dangerous, they are not what is defining the war, as much as Prigozhin would like you to think about this. Because first and foremost, Prigozhin is a liar. Like, he lies about many, many things. And most importantly, he is lying a lot to make sure that he comes out as a pretty guy. I'm pretty sure you've already followed, and as just an example, like, he was telling that for every one of the Wagner guys, there is 4 Ukrainians that die in Bakhmut. I can assure you, with everything, a bit of information, with every credibility piece that I have, that is not true. That is not even close. That is not even a ballpark true. Apparently, if you have a midway of attack where you don't count the a number of deaths and you're the attacking side, it's the enemy that loses 4 times as men. So it's a little bit silly. It's very, very, very silly. And obviously, Prigozhin is going to lie, and that is what we need to keep in mind, that whatever he says, it's not true. He's still Russian. If his lips are moving, there's a big chance that he's lying. Why does then discussing his persona and situation around Bakhmut is important? Well, mostly because of the implications. Because Prigozhin has put a very, very unpleasant situation, Putin especially, in a very unpleasant situation. And firstly, let's talk about the myth of Wagner might. Because we were under assumption that, like, if we believe Prigozhin, that when they arrived to Popasna, they were then able to break through at Popasna, which allowed the semi-encirclement of Severodonetsk and Lysychansk, and essentially led to Ukrainian army withdrawing from those towns. The important part here is to understand why Wagners are suddenly so effective. And the answer to that lies in a recent firing of the Russian, I believe, General Mizintsev, that was responsible for the supply of weaponry, because it was under the Mizintsev orders that Wagners were supplied with the ammunition that they have been requesting. If we recall ourselves, the destruction that were caused on Popasna was basically turned into dust. Ukrainian positions in that village were basically mixed with dust and so on. It was a hell on earth just because how much artillery shells were used on that direction. And then Prigozhin now hit Bakhmut, and in the recent days he's been very, very vocal about the lack of ammunition. Well, what is this lack of ammunition and where does it come from? And the answer is very simple. Because at some point, the Russian Ministry of Defense realized that ammunition that they are having, a lot of the ammunition is actually quite faulty. So instead of just using ammunition until they the way that they want, or like how much anyone want, then suddenly resources needed to be counted and resources needed to be accounted for, because units have been reporting that ammunition was not good and ammunition was not sufficient for all of the army. This is where the battle for Bakhmut is not the same as battle for Ukraine, because Prigozhin and Mizintsev, they were able to establish essentially a scheme in which some of the shells and ammunition that was supposed to go to some certain Russian units was funneled into Bakhmut. That is why, not Bakhmut, into the Wagner troops, and that is why Prigozhin was having such a big artillery advantage. Essentially, he was getting the artillery, as he discusses it, to fulfill his goals, because that's the tactics that they've been using in Syria. That's the tactics that they've been used for. They're having their own calculations for that. The problem is that this rate of use of artillery shells is 6 times more than a normal Russian units. So they were, for every shell that another normal Russian unit would fire, Prigozhin's army was able to fire 6 shells. It's a sickening thing to think about this, which obviously, like when the Russian Ministry of Defense started looking into their accounts, and if you remember recently after it was Gerasimov that took over the army, they started like treating the beards. They starting saying is like, okay, we need to have discipline in the army, and at the same time they were starting to make accounts for what kind of stocks and what kind of ammunition they're having. And I'm pretty sure at that moment they were like, holy shit, what is happening? Why is Wagner in such a privileged position? So what happened is that Wagner was just like, okay, they are, why are they so special? They're just having this part of front line where they're fighting for Bakhmut, and it's not even that important part of the front line. So instead of that, they would say, okay, now you get a normal ratio of shells compared to what everyone else is having. More importantly than that, they were also looking at the Ukrainian counteroffensive, and at some point they realized during their offensive operations, they realized that it's not going well. We're not making breakthroughs. We're not advancing enough. We're not doing everything. So we need to conserve the shells to go into the stalemate situation, to make sure that whatever happens, we will be able to stop and we will have enough ammunition to do it. Because the problem of Russians is a big logistics. After HIMARS arrived, moving shells around became a problem. So if shells are getting spent, it creates huge complications of driving large amounts of shells to the front lines. So local storages need to be filled. And that is the problem. Because Prigozhin says, like, oh my God, like not only he got now normal ratio of shells, there's also like generally lower consumption of shells allowed, because now the Ministry of Defense said we need to conserve our reserves for the coming counteroffensive. And this is where Wagner's situation gets problematic politically, because Prigozhin has made a lot of noise. Because Bakhmut became such a big propaganda piece, while it is a propaganda piece for us in the West, and it detracts us and twists our understanding of this war on like a normal level. Like we follow Bakhmut and how situation in Bakhmut is happening, and some of the people are projecting that like, oh, if the Bakhmut is lost, then Ukraine is suddenly losing the war, which is not true. But this is also true for the Russian observers. And Prigozhin knows this, because Bakhmut became such a hot topic for Russia. Prigozhin was able to elevate that, to then come out with certain public statements where he tried to leverage, the dead Wagnerites, which is hilarious, because like he was showing dead bodies of Wagnerites that died, but these guys that died, it was just like that day. We know that previous 5 months, Wagnerites lost their 20, 30,000 troops. And Prigozhin was like, yep, it's fine. We're taking Bakhmut, all good. Everything is okay. So it's obviously manipulation. So it was a huge manipulation campaign where Prigozhin tried to utilize his position in Bakhmut as a propaganda target and utilize the public picture to start pushing on Kremlin, on Putin, because Putin is very worried about public opinion. I remind you, Putin is extremely insecure. He's really worried about public uprising. He's really worried. So for him, having a picture that everything is okay and he's in control is very, very important, because this is what have been defined by this whole. I always say that Russia is a pretend state. So a lot of these Putins is like, oh, look, I have an election. Oh, look, like I'm being loved in media. Or look, like there's so many people supporting and having this rally. All of these things are super important for him, because he wants this public support, at least like perceived public support. And when Prigozhin utilizes a lot of these public narratives that create and potentially put pressure on Putin, Putin is now under threat. So what we know happened now is that Putin has called for a Security Council meeting overnight. In that meeting, they were directly discussing the supply of ammunition to Wagner and how to deal with Wagner situations to make sure that Prigozhin will shut the fuck up. I'm pretty sure that what was considered is like, do we need Prigozhin or should we incorporate Wagner into normal armed forces? The conclusion that they reached was that Prigozhin potentially can get more ammunition of what he was hoping for to kind of finish off Bakhmut. Basically, they sold the idea that there is a very small piece of Bakhmut left, so we're just going to finish it off. Just give us ammunition for this small operation, and that we're going to be done with this. As a mediator in between these two, if you remember this general dumbass with a bald head that cannot even speak one sentence properly, Surovikin, the General Armageddon, his nickname is. And so Surovikin came out as this mediator where in between the Ministry of Defense and Prigozhin. This is what Prigozhin claimed in the recent video audio file that was set out from him to the public. So in that file, he also, like, an important, usually he would call Bakhmut Bakhmut, which the same way that Ukrainians calling it, which is a huge no-no for a party line, because everyone else in the Russian propaganda sphere called this city by its Soviet name, Artyomovsk. And Artyomovsk, Prigozhin never called Bakhmut Artyomovsk. Never. He was always like Bakhmut, Bakhmut, Bakhmut. And then in this recording, he's saying that General Surovikin has reached out and said that they will provide all of the shells that we need after Putin called the Ministry of Defense meeting. And all of these shells are going to be for the Bakhmut operation, which he also referred to as like for the Artyomovsk operation. So we finished capturing Artyomovsk, which is a nice thing. So all in all, we understand that Putin caved. Putin tried to find some kind of ground in between the Ministry of Defense and their plans for defending against Ukrainian counteroffensive and their kind of conversation, their holding of the artillery shells, and to what Prigozhin wants as a public media. So he tried to negotiate that. Now, where are the problematic implications for Putin? The problem lies in the fact that what happened here is essentially there was a guy that was able to utilize and leverage certain aspects of the war against Putin. He was able to get Putin to act the way that he wanted. And normally Putin would not allow this, like, because leveraging of you, it's a big no-no. Yet here we are, seeing the next day where a guy was literally cursing at the head of the command of the Ministry of Defense of Russia, and just basically putting in a position that he must cave in. Why is this problematic? The problem is that the system relies on Putin to be in charge. Putin has a problem that while he himself is a very rational actor, because he has been acting very rationally throughout this war. Like, he acted on this war because he had bad intelligence. This much we know, and I will cover it more in the video that is going to be coming, very nice one. But more importantly, he's been acting also rationally throughout this war. He's been trying to say, okay, we need to keep Kherson because it's rational for him to keep them, because there were generals that were saying, yes, of course we can hold Kherson, up until they couldn't hold Kherson. So Putin gets frustrated by the fact that people continue lying to him. The problem is that while the Putin is trying to be rational and trying to be in charge, he's now stuck in a position where everything around them, the system that is happening on this war front line, is unraveling itself. As resources of the Russian military are becoming scarcer and scarcer, as we now see with the, for example, shells, there's like, okay, there's tension points between different parties. As these private companies suddenly start fighting in between each other, who is having which forces to fight, as the Ministry of Defense saying we have certain plans for our command, and yet there are other people that saying, oh, we have other plans for command, and actually we're losing the war, and so on. So there are voices that are talking against the plans of the Ministry of Defense. as Russian military will see defeat on the battlefield again and again and again and again with the coming Ukrainian counteroffensive, what we will see and what Putin will see is the unraveling of the system of command. There's going to be like essentially dog eat dog situation in there. We're going to start seeing more blame to each other. We're going to start seeing a lot of infighting. We're going to start seeing different parties yelling at each other. It's already now is become obvious because none of what's happening between Prigozhin and the Ministry of Defense should ever have been public. But it was the tool that Prigozhin had, and he utilized it, and it worked. And that is really bad news for Putin because it shows that he is desperate. So he felt that he need to cave in to a guy that said, yes, like these are like the bad people and so on, and yelled at everyone and put this all into public. That is extremely bad optics. Before, Putin was always staying in a driver's seat by utilizing just kind of one leverage tool that he got used to, raising stakes. However, this raising stakes problem has been already following him for a little while. Because the fact is that Russia has utilized every weapon and every capability on the battlefront. I know we in the West always like someone will come on the certain new interview or news channel and start discussing nuclear weapons. But let me be very clear. For Putin, a person that sits 10 meters apart from from his closest colleagues, is not going to use nuclear weapons. He's not. He's a coward. He's rational. He's not like a crazy man. But the fact is, as a good example, the recent drone strike on Kremlin. After that, Putin tried to raise the stakes. He ordered a strike with a Kinjal missile on Kyiv, most probably somewhere where it hurt, some important place. And Kinjal got shot down. That like it was even underreported just how significant it was that the most dangerous, the most modern Russian missiles that Putin has saw cartoons of striking deep inside of US is now just completely being apprehended by the newly utilized Patriot system. It is really bad for Putin because as time passes by, people around him, the system that's going to be unraveling, the players inside of the system that are going to start getting at each other's throat, they're going to see that Putin is not in control. Putin was never a strategist. He was an opportunist. He thought he saw an opportunity and he played it. And after that, whenever the opportunity didn't go well before, he would just raise the stakes. He would say, okay, more. And he would raise the stakes until everyone else would fold. No one is folding now. And problem for Putin, he does not have anything that can raise the stakes. Everything else just defaults himself. Thank you so much for watching this, guys. I love you all so much. Check out the first comment, support the Ukrainian military. You can support me at Buy Me at Coffee or join the YouTube program by hitting the join button. I love you all. Slava Ukraini, and I'll see you guys next time.